Welcome, everyone. I think we'll get underway. It's 6 o'clock Eastern, so let's get started. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where in the country you are. My name is Jillian McConnell, and I am the knowledge broker with Brain Exchange. And on behalf of my colleagues from the MS Society of Canada Ontario Division, I am so happy to have you on the call today. Today's webinar is the third of an 8-part learning series brought to you by the MS Society of Canada. And I will shortly be posting a link in the chat pod if you're interested in finding out more about our past or even upcoming future events. Before we begin, I do want to take a few minutes just to review the technology that we'll be using this evening. The audio is provided over the phone, which means if you're hearing my voice, then you're all set. And the visuals or the slides are provided by the online link that you should have received in the connection details. And that way you can watch the slides as our presenter speaks. On the bottom left of your screen, you'll see a blue bubble. And that is where you can actually, I'll just go back a bit. If you move your cursor or mouse over to that, you will see where it says chat with the presenter. And if you click on that, a chat pod should appear. And that's how you can communicate with me during the event as well as with the presenter. So I also want to note that only the presenter and I can see your notes in the chat pod, not your fellow participants that are on with you this evening. So this is also where you're going to be able to send your questions during the Q&A portion. And I'll get into more details later on about how that's going to work. I also want to make you aware that all of your lines have been muted for this call. And that just helps us minimize any background noise or private conversations that you may be having on the side regarding this particular presentation. If you need to ask a question or you have a concern, then please use the chat pod, as of course we won't be able to hear you. We are recording this presentation, this webinar event, so within a week or so, it will be available on the MS Society of Canada's website, as well as the Brain Exchange site as well, so you'll be able to access it there. So for the purpose of today, those are really the only features you need to be familiar with. The webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes in length, and our presenter will speak for about 60 to 70 minutes or so, and then we'll have the remainder of the time dedicated to some Q&A and hopefully a bit of a discussion. I do ask that people refrain from asking questions in the chat pod until the end of the presentation, unless of course it's technology related, and I'll do my best to help you out, or if it has something to do with an acronym or definition and impairs your understanding as we move forward throughout the webinar. Okay, so now that the technical aspects have been taken care of, I want to take this opportunity to just review a few bits of information that the MS Society has asked that I share with you on their behalf. So the MS Society of Canada Ontario Division wishes to gratefully acknowledge the educational grant received from Biogen, which makes possible the research update stem cell and clinical trial session that we're focusing on today. So the MS Society does not approve, endorse, or recommend any specific product or therapy, but provides information to assist individuals in making their own decisions. Identification of needs, determination of objectives, selection of content and speakers, educational methods, and materials are the sole responsibility of the MS staff and advisors. And also we wanted to just review the mission statement of the MS Society. And the mission statement is to be a leader in finding a cure for multiple sclerosis and enabling people affected by MS to enhance their quality of life. So now that that's covered, it's my pleasure to introduce our webinar topic and our presenter for this evening. Today we'll be talking about research updates and stem cell and clinical trials, and we're so pleased to have Angelica Asis with us here today. Angelica began as a coordinator in the research department in June 2012, and since then she has taken a keen interest in communications and began working on a communication strategy aimed at raising awareness of MS Society-funded research studies and sharing the latest updates in MS research and treatment with various audiences. Angelica currently serves as Manager of Research Information and Partnership, where she continues relay advances in MS research while building new research grants and education programs that address key priorities. Angelica obtained her Honors Bachelor of Science and Master of Science from the McMaster University in Hamilton and continues to be an active volunteer in various health charities and volunteer-based organizations. So we're very pleased to have her here today. And Angelica, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me, Jillian?
Yes, I can. Perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Jillian, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. It's a pleasure to be speaking to all of you about some of the research advances, some of the stuff that the Society is supporting, as well as a bit of an update on stem cells, which I know is a very important topic to people living with MS. So I'm happy to provide updates at the end of my presentation on that as well. So I just want to start with this slide here, which is a slide that we all recognize. You know, a lot of us have participated in many of the MS Society's fundraising events, like our MS Walk, Bike, Readathon, et cetera. But when we fundraise and when people go out to try to raise money for research, the questions that often come up are, and I'm just going to change the slide here, are what areas of research do we fund? Where does the money go when we raise all this money through the MS Walk and Bike, et cetera? And how does that decision ultimately be made? Who makes that decision, and what factors go into deciding where the money goes in terms of research? And ultimately, how will the research we fund bring us closer to a cure? What is the impact of the research that the Society funds, essentially? So these are questions that, as fundraisers or as volunteers of the MS Society, and when interacting with people in the community about, what the MS Society does and what our mission is, as Jillian mentioned in the beginning, these are kind of the kinds of questions that I would assume come up, or questions that we get on a daily basis, especially when doing presentations like these. So just to provide sort of a high-level overview before we get into the details, the Society funds approximately $11 to $13 million of research in MS each year, and that's largely conducted in Canada. But recently we've been funding research that also takes place globally, and research that Canadian researchers collaborate with on a global level. And since 1948, since the inception of the organization, we have provided over $160 million of funding for research in Canada, and as I mentioned, abroad as well. And this is such a significant contribution when you look at it, big picture like this. And when we stack up against other health charities, other funding agencies, we should be very proud, I feel, of the investments that we've made in research and the outcomes that we've seen as a result of that investment. And not only have we seen outcomes in terms of breakthroughs, but the Society, through its funding, has essentially developed a pipeline of exceptional MS researchers and has become a leading contributor to discovery in the field of MS. So we've really positioned Canada as a leader in the search for a cure for MS, and have built a pretty robust network of Canadian, not only senior MS researchers, but junior researchers as well, people who are training to become neurologists or scientists in the lab focused on MS. And what we've also seen is we've attracted a lot of talent from outside the MS field, from areas like Alzheimer's and other neurological conditions, or immunology, or clinical and population health. We've really lured them into the MS space because there's still so many complex questions that remain unanswered. And so it's great to see people from other fields working with the MS researchers, or entering into the MS field to really solve these questions. So what type of research, what type of topics do MS scientists cover? And so this is just a breakdown. This is actually from last year. And this is just a distribution of the different areas of research that the MS Society funds through its grants and awards. And so a majority of it does focus on progression and therapies, so trying to understand emerging treatments, their mechanisms, how they might repair or protect the central nervous system, looking at ways of following the success of treatments and trials, like looking at imaging tools, trying to understand different outcome measures of trials, different measurements of treatment success, drug repurposing. So what that means is taking an existing drug for another condition and seeing if it has application in MS due to its mode of action in the body. But also we fund areas like nerve damage and repair, so trying to understand remyelination, the immunological factors that are contributing to damage in the central nervous system, how cells talk to one another, so that's cell signaling. And we also look at cause and risk factors, so what are the modifiable lifestyle factors that might increase one's risk for MS? Does the virus infection play a role, genetics, immune triggers, et cetera? And trying to understand symptom management, quality of life in detail in terms of the research that's taking place in cognition, exercise and rehabilitation, population patterns, so where across Canada do we see higher rates of MS, or where around the world does vitamin D play a role in that, for example. Pain and fatigue, coexisting conditions, people living with MS, what other conditions are they affected by, and how does that impact the effects of treatments or the quality of life or long-term care. Healthcare utilization. So this is just a small, very small snapshot of the breadth of the research that the Society funds, and it really speaks to the complexity of MS and the fact that I think it's really great that our competitions are open, meaning researchers can apply and focus on a number of different areas. We don't necessarily dictate what topic they should focus on, but instead have them apply and present what they feel would be worth studying, and we evaluate if that's feasible and if there's relevance to MS. But otherwise, the researchers do come to us looking at various topics like these and others to try to really, again, address some of the complex questions associated with the cause and treatment of MS. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about, in terms of breadth, not just topics, but the type of research in general. So some of those topics I mentioned earlier fall under the realm of what we call basic science or discovery research, so that box in red. And discovery research is research that takes place at the bench. This is cellular work, molecular work, looking at things at the very microscopic level, trying to understand the basic mechanism of MS that underlies the symptoms that we see manifest in people who live with MS. What is the trigger that's causing those symptoms is what basic scientists are trying to understand. And we fund a lot of research in this area. In fact, the majority of the research that we support does cover the basic science, and we think that's extremely important because basic science is what's going to drive the entire field. Basic science unveils new potential targets for treatment, new insights into the cause. It helps us to prognosticate and diagnose MS, manage the disease more effectively, develop personalized medicine approaches. So basic science really helps to drive all of those things. And I know it might be less tangible to people in terms of what are the outcomes, because it can get very technical and it's really about the nitty-gritty. But ultimately, we need to understand the nitty-gritty in order to really build more effective and safe treatments for people living with MS. But at the same time, the Society does also fund other areas of the research spectrum. So drug discovery. And the reason why this is an arrow that falls after basic science is because the basic scientists, like those pictured here, uncover some really interesting molecules that they feel have the potential, if targeted, to treat MS. And so how does that get translated or moved along the pipeline into potentially a clinical trial? Well, drug discovery has to take place. You may also have heard the term translational research. So that's taking research from the bench and essentially bringing it bedside by testing it in other models of MS, like animal models that resemble the MS disease, doing tests to understand if the potential treatment is tolerable in the body, if it's safe, what kind of different formulations need to be tested, like if it's an oral medication. So all of these things need to happen in order for us to what we call de-risk the discovery, to make it more of a potential treatment, and then from there they can take it into human clinical trials. So this green area is extremely important, and often people refer to it as the valley of death. And I know that sounds a bit scary, but essentially what that means is not very many industries, organizations fund this area because of the risk that's involved. A lot of the ideas that come from basic science don't often make it to clinical trials because they fall within this space of discovery, drug discovery. And so the MS Society is looking to fund more research in this area in order to form that bridge between the bench to the bedside and accelerate the pace of research so that we can get treatments to people faster. So these logos here are the National MS Societies. They have a commercial research arm called Fast Forward, as well as the Center for Drug Research and Development based in Vancouver. They're both organizations that focus on drug discovery, drug development. They have the expertise on board. They have the infrastructure that the MS Society may not have, but can leverage in order to increase more research effort in this area and really help these ideas move along so that they enter clinical trials. So if there's a protein that seems to be involved in MS, the drug discovery field helps to test that protein to see if there is a treatment out there that could block it and essentially improve symptoms in people living with MS. So that's what they're responsible for doing, and the Society has been working with both of these organizations very closely. The MS Society also funds clinical trials. So basic science is important, drug discovery is important, but once we get a successful treatment, how can we ensure that there's enough funding to test that in clinical trials involving people? And so pictured here is Mark Friedman. You're all very familiar with the bone marrow transplantation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the MS Society funded that and other trials to really provide opportunities for these researchers to test these novel ideas that otherwise might not be as palatable to, let's say, a pharmaceutical company. So pharmaceutical companies do focus on novel agents, whereas stem cell trials might be, not as commercializable. So the MS Society does invest in areas like this in order to see success, in order to see answers come from these trials and to translate those answers into something meaningful in the clinic. And so the bone marrow transplantation trial is just one example of several clinical trials that the MS Society has funded. Trials are very expensive, and so we do fund smaller trials, but trials nonetheless that, again, test really innovative approaches like the application of stem cells. And then ultimately, once an idea has moved from basic science to drug discovery to clinical trials, and the trials are positive, then we can only hope that Health Canada reviews that data and approves that treatment for use for people living with MS. That's really the ultimate goal. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the decision-making process, because going back to the initial slide, one of the questions is, well, how do we decide what kind of research gets funded? And it's not ultimately up to we, as in, the staff here, but we really leave it up to the experts in the field who are able to evaluate applications and make the appropriate judgment as to which ones have the highest scientific merit, which ones are of the highest scientific quality. So you can read through these steps, as I speak, but essentially, from a top-level perspective, what happens is when we hold a competition for research funding, we invite investigators or scientists to apply for funding through an application process. So they fill in the application online, they submit the relevant documents, and they provide everything that they need in order to complete their application. And we vet that on our end to ensure that everything is in place, like the investigator's CV, their scientific rationale, their ethics. So we look for a number of documents that are part of their application. The applications are essentially reviewed at home by an independent panel of experts that the Society puts together depending on the scope of the competition. So for the competition we hold every year, which is called our Annual Research Grants and Awards Competition, we put together 3 different committees that focus on different areas of research, one being biomedical, one being clinical research, and one being for the student awards, so our doctoral studentships, masters, and postdoc fellowships. And we shuffle around the experts depending on the types of applications we receive. If there's a lot of imaging applications or a lot of genetics applications, we ensure that experts in those fields are represented on the panel so that they have the expertise that can allow them to read through and properly evaluate those applications. So when we've assembled those panels and we identify the right experts, we provide them with the applications that they review confidentially at home. They provide comments online, and then they meet in person to also have a more fulsome discussion. So it doesn't just end with an online submission of their comments. They still have to meet in person or in some cases by phone to fully deliberate these applications and really bounce off each other's feedback and ideas so that there's a more enriched discussion that allows them to make a proper recommendation for funding. There's also a scoring process involved in our grant reviews. So based on the discussions, the people around the room do have to provide scores. And the scores are based off a scale that we adopted from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, who also does their own grant competition. So we have a 5-point scale, and we have everyone score, and then we see where everyone ranks, and the committee ultimately decides where on that list they should provide a cutoff recommendation. So if there's 20 applications that fall in the fundable range, and they're comfortable with cutting it off at a score of 3.8, then they make that recommendation to our medical advisory committee. And this is based from really extensive discussions around the table. So it's not something that they just do blindly. There's a lot of time and care put into these discussions so that the scores are appropriately assigned. And I should also mention that we have people living with MS on the panel. So we call these individuals community representatives. Some of you on the phone may have served as a community representative or applied to serve as one. And these are people who provide the personal perspective on behalf of the community. So they provide the perspective of people living with MS and comment on whether this project would be relevant to them, interesting, would have an impact, something that they want to see funded, something that touches the MS community personally and is a challenge that people with MS face or something that is an unmet need. And so that perspective is highly important. It certainly shapes the discussion, and it allows for that humanized perspective to come to the table. It's not just about scientific merit, it's ultimately about impact and improving quality of life. And so these recommendations are then sent, as I said, to our medical advisory committees. There are an overarching governing body of scientists, doctors, and some of our board members and people living with MS, and they review all of these recommendations, and they ultimately make their recommendation to the national board. So in fact, I was just at the national board meeting today presenting our recommendations from our January review meeting, and that went well. So what we do next is we announce who was successful in the competition on our website. So after the board has reviewed everything and they've said that all looks good, the budget is aligned, priorities are aligned, and we get the okay, we then post that information on our website and we issue agreements to our researchers to begin funding them. So this is just a picture here of the review process. So around this table are researchers, our clinical experts. There's Dr. Jiwan Oh in the striped sweater. She's a neurologist from St. Mike's Hospital here in Toronto, as well as people living with MS. So at the back with the black sweater and the red hair is Jenny Gauthier. She's from New Brunswick, and she's a person living with MS who serves as a community representative. So this is just a picture of what goes on behind the scenes, lots of computers, lots of intense faces, but ultimately it's a pretty long day, and the recommendations that come from these meetings go forward to the board. So it doesn't really end there. So once we give the money and all the awards are given out, then we still want to ensure that there's transparency and accountability among researchers and that we don't just give the money and walk away. So we do have a requirement that they submit progress reports that not only report on their scientific progress, but also on their financial, not progress, but their financial accountability. So we need them to demonstrate that they're spending the funds appropriately, that they're spending funds as per the approved budget, and also that they're meeting their scientific aims and they're showing progress in their work. So we heavily vet those on a yearly basis to ensure that the money that we're giving out is being adequately and appropriately used. But really, where did this all start in terms of, some of the things I mentioned earlier about priorities and things like that? I think moving forward, the society has really tried to focus in more on not just the areas of research across that spectrum that I showed, but what people living with MS want to see in terms of where the money should go. I think there was a turning point in society where the organization recognized that the voices of people living with MS should remain at the center of our work, and research is no exception to that. The research that we fund should be a reflection of what the community feels is valuable and will have an impact. And so in 2012, our Vice President of Research, Karen Lee, and Vice President of Program and Services, Sylvia Leonard, traveled across Canada, and they essentially spoke to different stakeholders, so 7 regions, 200 participants, and they asked them simply, what does research mean to you? And that question yielded a lot of really great insight for the society and helped us learn a lot about what the priorities are for people affected by MS. And essentially a few key trends came out. People want to see more communication about research. They want to hear from the researchers themselves. They want to engage with researchers. They want to see translation. They want to see acceleration. They want to see tangible results from research sooner rather than later. And they feel that research brings them hope for a healthier future. And really, people with MS are passionate about research and want to stay up to date and want to be involved in research in a meaningful way. And we also heard about some important priorities that people living with MS felt that more research or more attention and dollars need to be placed towards. So understanding the cause of MS, which we all know is still not fully understood, cognition and mental health, life-modifying therapies, so what role, for example, does nutrition, vitamin D, exercise play, diagnosis, repair, and progressive MS. And at the bottom, what we heard loud and clear was, again, the theme of accelerating the pace of research, which is really the critical aspect. Is many people express that they feel they'll never see the results of research in their lifetime, and often they express that they're often discouraged that clinical trials and research studies take a very, very long time, which they do, and that's just the nature of science itself, but what can the society do to help move that along a lot quicker? And this is especially relevant for progressive MS. So there are many therapies approved for relapsing remitting MS in Canada, with many more in the pipeline. but there are 0 therapies available for progressive forms of MS. And so this is the biggest unmet need, I think, in the world in terms of MS research, and there's been a lot of effort being placed into this area to help understand the disease, that part of the disease a little bit more, and what potential targets could be focused on to build treatments for this form of MS. One example of how the society has really taken a step forward in terms of accelerating research in progressive MS is by joining the international, not only joining, being a founding member of the International Progressive MS Alliance. So this is a global consortium of MS societies, research experts, clinical experts, and people living with MS. So it's a really diverse group of people who are all coming together on with a single goal in mind, and that's to expedite the development of treatments for progressive MS, and really to focus all of our efforts and leverage our resources and knowledge and connections to help make this a reality sooner. And so far it's been extremely successful. If you go to progressivemsalliance.org, you can look over some of the research that they've been funding, some of the strategic initiatives of the Alliance, where they see the future going in terms of what kind of things they're going to support. So the Alliance has been a very active group, and we continue to remain very committed to this group, and we meet frequently to discuss the progress of the research that we've been funding. In fact, they just recently announced a $4.5 million project that they are funding at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, and that's led by Dr. Douglas Arnold. He's a neurologist and an imaging expert, and he will actually be collecting thousands of MRI images from phase 3 clinical trials for progressive MS to try to find very characteristic patterns, brain imaging patterns that can be used as biomarkers for progressive MS trials. And the reason he's doing that is because ultimately, if you find the right biomarker, you can shorten a clinical trial by much more, and you can make it, you can get through a trial much quicker if you have the right marker, because it can signal if a treatment's working or not. And so right now, for progressive MS trials, the only real imaging marker that's being used is brain atrophy, and it's not fully validated. It's validated, but it doesn't tell the full picture of what's happening in progressive MS. So they need something more sensitive, more characteristic of the disease, and Doug Arnold is trying to elucidate that in his study to try to build a tool that can speed up clinical trials for progressive MS. And that's really the missing link right now, and the Alliance is very excited to see where that project goes. So we're very proud of Doug Arnold, and he's the one Canadian in the group. The 2 other large projects that are being funded are from the US and Italy. So I mentioned the Center for Drug Research and Development, and this is another approach that we're taking to, again, accelerate the pace of research and build that bridge between bench to bedside. We want to ensure that researchers are not only aware of the therapeutic potential of their research, but are working with the right experts that otherwise they might not have access to in their own academic institutions. So pictured here is Karen Lee. She met with the former CEO of CDRD, Karim Sabar. And that partnership was formed several years ago, but we've seen a lot of progress in these studies, one being from Craig Moore, who's pictured here from Memorial, and one from Veronique Miron, who's a Canadian researcher who's now doing her research in MS at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. So these are just 2 of the group of researchers that we funded to work closely with CDRD to really understand the drug development process, to work with the right experts there in areas like toxicology, in chemistry, biochemistry, in formulation, all of these very, very specific trades and very, very specific experts that are not available, nor are they fundable through traditional operating grants in a regular research lab. This is a highly specialized group of experts that we've been privileged to have access to through our partnership with CDRD, and have been able to fund researchers to work closely with them. And so far we've seen some interesting results in terms of potential therapies for repair, trying to understand the immune aspects of progressive MS. So some interesting results, and those are available online on our website. So shifting focus now to some other efforts that we're doing before I jump into the stem cell trials piece, is I wanted to touch on some of the other projects that the Society is focusing on, one being a new shift in our focus to wellness. So we've heard loud and clear again from people living with MS through the research priorities discussion and through this survey that's pictured here, that wellness is an important aspect of the lives of people affected by MS, and they want to see what kind of research is happening out there and what answers can research provide us about how exercising and specific diets and other lifestyle interventions are having an impact on their disease, or could be triggers or causative factors for their disease if they have a poor diet, for example. So we've heard through this survey that we put out last August that there are some unmet needs in wellness research that people living with MS feel are important to address. And so based on that, the Society actually, and here are just some quick results, and again, you can find this on our website as well. This is just highlighting some of the interesting findings that we got from the survey. And so based on the results of that survey and based on the voices of people living with MS, we did launch a number of different research competitions that were quite unique, and we hadn't done this before, but it was very interesting because it was, again, a shift from more of the basic science to understanding wellness and the role that wellness can play in MS. So here on the left, I think I can use my, let's see here. There we go. So my green arrow is pointing to my colleague Peter in the research team, and Peter traveled to the University of Waterloo to meet with students there who are participating in what's called a hackathon. So for those of you who don't know, a hackathon is sort of a crash course event where you meet with strangers and you come up with really cool technologies and ideas and softwares, and you're supposed to come up with them in a short period of time. So it's like a little pressure cooker test. And this was a special hackathon in that it had to have a health spin, and that whatever they discovered or developed would have to address a major challenge faced by people with MS or Alzheimer's or dementia. And so Peter traveled to Waterloo to meet with these students while they were involved in this hackathon and shared some of the results of the survey. So, use this as a guide to help you identify what some of the challenges are, where people want to see more research in. And the students really enjoyed that, learned a lot about MS and about the stuff that we saw, that we heard in the survey. And they were quite enlightened and used that as their inspiration for developing new technologies. And ultimately, the group here in the bottom screen that I'm pointing to, bottom of the screen that I'm pointing to, is the group that was awarded $15,000 from the MS Society for their pitch, for their idea. And it was a wearable device that tracks MS symptoms in real time and transmits them to a database where it can be tracked and shared and ultimately used to help guide treatment decisions or to have conversations with their healthcare professionals. So again, a really young but bright group of students who were really inspired by the people living with MS that they met at the hackathon and in their research following up to that, and got in touch with the local MS chapter and a neurologist in the community and really learned a lot, and that helped to shape their technology. And now they're actually finished developing the prototype and are looking to test it in people living with MS. So that's really exciting. We're curious to see where that goes. And then moving on, we also received a very generous donation from Hermes Canada, the clothing brand. A member of their team has a very close connection to MS, and so they provided $160,000 in funding to launch a wellness competition. So again, this is very much in line with our priority of focusing some research dollars in wellness and builds on the hackathon project that I just showed you. So we established the Hermes Canada MS Society Wellness Research Innovation Grant with this generous donation, and we were looking to award $40,000 for up to 4 grants that would not only address wellness challenges or be focused in wellness research, but also address some of the things that were in the wellness survey. So again, we tied that survey, ensured that perspective was represented in this process. And so we received 11 applications, and they were subject to review by a wellness expert committee, similar process that I described earlier. And 3 applications were ultimately selected. And they've begun their projects, and one of them has already finished recruitment, so that's really exciting. And just to give you a bit of an update on these studies, these are the 3 PIs, or investigators, who were awarded the 3 Wellness Research Innovation Grants. Dr. Charity Evans will lead the first study in Canada to examine the impact of Pilates in MS. She'll be working very closely with Jenna Danielson. She owns a multidisciplinary health and wellness studio called Lead Integrated Health Therapies. And together they'll conduct a 12-week randomized control trial in 30 people to evaluate the effects of 50-minute Pilates classes twice a week, plus weekly one-hour massage therapy, and there'll be a control in there, so they'll only have a group that does massage therapy, and they'll compare the two groups. So they fulfilled all of their recruitment in Saskatchewan, so that's really exciting. There's been a lot of interest in this study there, so that's great. Dr. Catherine Knox, also from Saskatchewan, she's going to lead an interdisciplinary team of physiotherapists, healthcare providers, and people living with MS to develop a web-based physiotherapy program for people with moderate to severe disability. And they'll assess adherence, acceptability, and safety of this exercise program in 45 people with MS over 6 months. And then finally, Dr. Anne Ye from the University of Toronto, and she's also a pediatric MS specialist at Hospital for Sick Children. And she is going to develop an intervention to increase physical activity in youth by providing an accessible and sustainable alternative to group-based exercise programs. She's going to take advantage of widespread access to internet and mobile devices among the youth, and will develop a physical activity app tailored to youth with MS and evaluate its usability. So she's actually partnering with a group called Kite and Canary in Toronto, who is a health-based app development company. So the purpose of this whole exercise was to encourage these researchers to essentially collaborate with what we call community innovators, or people in the community who have direct interactions with people living with MS and who understand the importance of these types of interventions and who lead these types of interventions or develop these types of technologies on a day-to-day basis. So it's really exciting to see that this work is progressing. Okay. Just one piece about vitamin D, because I know this is an area of increasing interest among people in the community. So I just wanted to touch on this briefly and just say that the research in this area is quite active at the moment. It is pointing to the notion that low levels of vitamin D does contribute to an increased risk of MS. There is no evidence to suggest it causes MS or that low vitamin D, we don't know what that relative contribution might look like, if it's a large contribution to risk or not. But we do know that studies are pointing to some level of association between deficiency in vitamin D and MS risk. And I think, a lot of people have questions of why does MS have the highest rate, why does Canada rather have the highest rate of MS? Even in Europe or in Scandinavia, those people at the higher latitudes also have an increased risk of MS versus on lower latitudes. So your mind starts to wander to the idea that low vitamin D might have a role. So a lot of researchers are exploring this. These types of studies are quite difficult to design. So there is potential for other factors having a role in influencing the results, or the data is not quite clean enough to suggest that one causes the other. But it is pointing to an association. And so as a result, people with MS are raising questions of how much should I take? Should I get screened for levels of vitamin D in the blood? Should I be regularly monitored? If I have MS, what does that mean for my children? Do they have to get screened? And so, at the moment, Health Canada does advise that you take between 600 to up to 4,000 international units of vitamin D. So a supplement, for example, is typically 1,000 IUs. And so, we're hearing from a lot of people that neurologists suggest you might as well go for the upper limit because it's considered safe. It's still recommended by Health Canada, and it's not very expensive to take vitamin D, so to just take it. But again, there really is no evidence at this stage to suggest that low vitamin D increases risk, nor is there enough evidence to suggest that if you have MS, taking vitamin D could alter the disease. But there is some really interesting molecular and cellular work that says that vitamin D has an impact on the immune system. It interacts with various cells of the central nervous system. So, again, these are pointing to the idea that vitamin D does have a role, but what that role looks like is still unknown. But the society, in recognizing that people with MS do want some clear guidance, has put together a panel of experts in vitamin D and MS. And they met last year actually to talk about what the evidence is saying, to come up with some clear guidelines. And so we're at that stage now where those guidelines are slowly being developed, and we're looking to put together something for the website or something that we could potentially publish in a scientific journal over the next few months or so. But that, I think, will be a really helpful tool in guiding people through some of the questions they might have about vitamin D, like, can I get it from food? And if I do I have to take it do I have to eat it at a certain time of day or take a supplement at a certain time of day? And how much do I get from the sun? So there are a lot of questions that we receive about vitamin D, and I think having that resource that we're currently working on would be a really great start in terms of helping provide that information to people. So stem cells. I don't know if I should stop for questions, but I guess I'll keep trucking on. I know people probably have a lot of questions, but I'll try to go through this part quickly so that there's time for questions. But stem cells. So this is, again, probably one of the hottest topics. As a person working in the research department, I get sent in questions from staff, from people directly from the community, from even other researchers about the role that stem cells have in MS. And so the team has been monitoring advances in this area quite closely. And as you know, and as I mentioned earlier, we've also funded some stem cell research that has provided some really interesting insights into the role that stem cells play as a treatment for MS. So just a little 101. Embryonic stem cells, which is the stem cell that we all often hear about, which are derived from embryos, are considered pluripotent stem cells. So this means that stem cells can create copies of themselves. So the stem cell can not only create an exact copy of itself, but being pluripotent means that it can become any type of cell in the body. And that's essentially the rule of development. We start off as stem cells and we grow into all the different parts and we become people. But that's what makes it kind of enticing to look at embryonic stem cells from a research stage, because in terms of regenerative therapies, it is appealing that these cells can become essentially any type of tissue in the body. But I know, given that there are obviously ethical concerns, what's interesting nowadays is this blue cell here at the bottom is the new sort of embryonic stem cell that isn't derived from embryo. So this is called an induced pluripotent stem cell. And what scientists have been able to do, and the guy who discovered this won a Nobel Prize for this work, is he took human developed cells, so cells that were already part of us, so in this case skin cells, and was able to manipulate them to become an embryonic stem cell-like cell. So it has the properties of an embryonic stem cell, but it's not derived from an embryo. So you bypass all those ethical issues. You don't need to take them from embryos. You, in fact, are able to manipulate existing adult cells and turn them into these pluripotent stem cells. So it's quite fascinating. There's been a lot of work in this area to understand what these induced pluripotent stem cells can do and what their potential is for treatment of diseases. But that's just a little side note. The stem cells that are currently being looked at for MS are these adult stem cells. So they're the ones in the green, red, and orange. And these are not entirely pluripotent. They can't become anything, but they can become something. They just become a specialized something. So the green cell in this case becomes a cell in the nervous system. Red becomes a blood cell. So they have a destined path. It's not necessarily they become any tissue. They have a destined path. And so stem cells that are being tested for MS fall in this category. They're cells that are stem cells, but they're specific types of stem cells that the researchers are trying to harness their natural capabilities to see if there's potential for them in MS. So the first one, actually, before I go to Mezcams, I want to start here if I can. I don't know if I can. Actually, there we go. So I want to start here, actually, which is the Canadian bone marrow stem cell trial. This was really the first stem cell trial that the society had supported, and was really a really landmark, pioneering, really key study in the field of stem cells in MS specifically. And so this began in 2000 when the MS Scientific Research Foundation, who the society is affiliated with, funded this multi-center clinical trial at an amount of about $6.4 million. And this became to be known as the Canadian Bone Marrow Transplantation Trial. Many of you on the phone are probably very familiar with this study. And I'm bringing this up because it was published just last year. So you can imagine the amount of follow-up work that was done, if it started all the way in 2000, to really understand the long-term effects of this treatment, the safety, and look at these people in more detail to see what changed in them immunologically that led to the benefits that they saw. And so essentially, according to the published findings, this treatment, so what it is they give them chemotherapy, they eliminate the immune system, which is thought to be causing MS, and they repopulated the immune system with fresh bone marrow stem cells or hematopoietic stem cells. So like the picture I showed you, those are the adult stem cells that give rise to blood. So they took their own stem cells, in fact, this wasn't from a stranger. They took their own stem cells, gave them the chemo, and reconstituted the stem cells, and it grew a new immune system. They were hoping initially to intercept the signal that causes MS and understand how MS may develop, but instead what they found is 23 out of the 24 participants that were treated had no new relapses, no new disease. So that was quite remarkable. According to the publication, they also found that 70% of the participants showed no disability progression, so they didn't worsen, and 40% of the participants experienced an unexpected recovery of function, which is really the remarkable piece. And some of you may have heard about from Jen Molson. She's been very public. She's one of the patients who received the trial. She talks about how she was bedridden and now able to dance at her wedding and ride a bike. And so really that reversal of disability, that recovery of a function was really what was most interesting. And it speaks a lot to what role inflammation, which is what they were essentially targeting, might play in progression of the disease. So there was a lot that was learned from that trial. However, with that said, given that you're completely eliminating the immune system, you're giving them intense chemotherapy, a very strong regimen, one person did die from complications, so we can't overlook the safety concerns and the risk that come with this type of procedure. So as a result, this procedure is being offered at the Ottawa Hospital, but it is high risk, and it is intended for a small group of people who have highly inflammatory activities, do not respond to treatments, show rapid advancement of disease. And so again, this is a small group of people, but the goal here is to try to study stem cells a little bit more to see if certain things can be modified so that it can be applied to a broader group of MS patients. So this was a really important study. I would argue one of the most successful studies that the Society has funded that's really yielded some really interesting and groundbreaking results. And the long-term follow-up aspect is really important because if we can now say we have up to 13 years of follow-up data to really understand the safety of these types of stem cell therapies. So I'm just going to quickly go back and finish the last 15 minutes on Mezcams. And Mezcams stands for Mesenchymal Therapy for Canadian MS Patients. So this is the latest, Mark Friedman and Harry Atkins, they were the investigators of the bone marrow trial. They led that out of Ottawa. But Mark Friedman has now gone on to study a new type of stem cell that has shown a lot of promise for MS. It used to be used as a treatment for graft versus host disease. So when you get a transplant, an organ transplant, and you have that inflammatory reaction, they would apply mesenchymal stem cells to counter that inflammation. So they realized that there might be an anti-inflammatory property that they can harness and leverage as a treatment for MS. And so a lot of work was done in animals that had an MS-like disease to see if there was some effect. And they did see some positive effects. And so that was really the jumping point for Mark to explore mesenchymal stem cells in people living with MS. So he's now leading I'm just going to advance the slide, a clinical trial. It's based in two sites, the Ottawa Hospital and the Health Sciences Centre in Winnipeg, and James Marriott is the neurologist who oversees the Winnipeg site. It's a phase 2 proof of concept. So what that means is they now have an idea that these stem cells could have an effect, but they need to prove it. They need to prove the concept by testing it in people, in a small group of people, to see if it's what they propose it's doing, to see if the treatment is doing what they're proposing, essentially. So they're looking to recruit and treat 40 participants. So it says crossover, and what that means there is that half of the participants at each site will start with the stem cells, and the other half will start with just a placebo treatment, so not stem cells, and then they'll switch, and they won't know, so it's blinded. They'll switch after 6 months, so everybody gets treated with the stem cells, essentially. And really the aim of this trial is to see if the mesenchymal stem cells can control the inflammation and potentially repair damaged areas in the brain and spinal cord. But more importantly, is it safe? That's the other big question. So this slide, going back actually, I wanted to place this slide to really show the excitement that people living with MS have for stem cells. And this was actually the most successful social media post that the Society has seen in history. So So a lot of hits, a lot of shares, a lot of retweets, a lot of comments, a lot of excitement and positivity. So again, this speaks to really the community's interest in stem cells, and it's great to see. And I think the society really has taken a leading role in funding more research in stem cells to address, that interest that the community has for this type and the potential that we're seeing in this type of treatment. So just to give you, an update on the trial. So the study is still ongoing. They have 10 participants now at Ottawa. 3 have completed their treatment, and 2 are enrolled in the Winnipeg site. Because Research Manitoba, which is the provincial funding agency out there, has funded a significant portion of the trial, for the Winnipeg site, they are only looking for people in Manitoba. I'm not sure if that will change because of the recruitment being a bit slow, but they are still focused on trying to find people in Manitoba. The Ottawa site does accept people from across Canada. Again, they have to be referred by their neurologist, or they can contact the site to see if they might be eligible. So I encourage you, if you're interested in participating in this trial, best route is to go to msresearch.ca, our research portal. The study is listed there, and they have a contact section where they have emails of the 2 study coordinators that you can reach out to and see if you are eligible, or if you have any questions about the study and what it entails and how long will you have to be there, and et cetera. All those questions, we encourage you to direct that to the study coordinators who are listed on our research portal. Because it looks like they are still looking to fill their recruitment quota. So that's where that study is right now, and we continue to monitor and update the public on this trial on our website. In terms of stem cells overall, so we still emphasize that these cell-based therapies are still under investigation. They are still considered experimental. So, in Ottawa, they do accept some referrals for the bone marrow transplantation. But again, it's more offered on an off-label kind of process. This is a treatment that's usually given as a cancer treatment. So, given what they've seen in trials, there is openness for the researchers to and the doctors there in Ottawa to test to apply this treatment in MS patients. But we still largely, on a global level, the research community still considers this highly experimental, and that's because there's no one approach that seems to be 100% safe and 100% efficacious. There's still a lot of safety concern. They don't know what chemotherapy to use for the bone marrow transplant trial. Mesenchymal stem cells, it's still early days. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But the good news is there are a lot of trials that have now been completed or are underway. So 10 trials in stem cells for MS have been completed, and they are providing some evidence on the long-term effects and safety of these treatments. And the mesenchymal stem cell therapy trial, as I've mentioned, is still underway. So and others are still underway. And so we have a link on our website. I'm happy to share that afterwards to a list of all the trials that have been completed in stem cells and a list of trials that are active in recruiting. Or you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, and they also have a list. If you type stem cells and MS, they're able to pull up a list of all the trials and give you a status update. So that's a really great tool as well if you're curious about what's happening on the global level. And I just want to really close off with this here, because I think there's a lot of content I shared with you today, but the good news is a lot of it is available. So a lot of this is online. And so going back to the first slide, when you're fundraising, you're answering questions, you want to have the information with you, or you want to keep yourself informed. Best bet is to just go on our website, subscribe to our Research in Action newsletter, join Twitter and follow Dr. Karen Lee, our Vice President. Follow her blog. These are some great resources that are at your disposal where you can continually stay up to date on research. Our research summaries, which is the second one there, are an overview of all the studies we're funding. So this isn't really research updates, but rather the grants that we're funding, what areas, what are the key findings, things like that. And MS Updates at the top is just a list of all the news updates that come of studies that we're funding or that are happening around the world. So these are just really a handful of our really valuable tools that we've developed that help to keep the public informed about what's happening in research. So you're welcome to share these, or you can write to us and say, I really want a copy of this MS research that's pictured here. I want to bring it with me to an event, or if you're volunteering somewhere and you want to share the research updates at the society, you can bring one of these pieces with you. So there's a lot at your disposal that you can use to keep informed. So I will end there, and looks like I'm right on time. And yeah, I'll turn it back to you, Jillian.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was terrific. Very interesting, actually, to see what types of work is happening in different locations. So thank you for that. Before we open up the forum to questions, I just want to quickly just review a few things. First of all, how to ask questions. So you have two different options. You can type your question into the chat pod, and that way. And I also want to emphasize that again, that only Angelica and I are able to see the questions that you've posted in the chat pod, so it remains anonymous amongst the group of you. Or alternatively, if you would like to ask the question over the phone, you can unmute your individual line, and to do so, you press *7 on your phone. However, I ask only those who are interested in asking a question unmute their lines. I also want to note that while this Q&A discussion will be happening, I'm going to be posting some poll questions, and I really want to invite all of you to answer them all before we leave this evening. So we still have another half hour or so please hang on till the end. With respect to the poll questions, your answers are anonymous, but they certainly help us have a better sense of how this particular event was received, and then will help us tailor future webinars to meet your needs. And then finally, just one other thing to note, Angelica will do her best to answer all the questions that are provided to her. And I'm just asking of her, we're asking of two things. One, just because we do have lots of people on the line, so please keep your questions brief. And two, we do ask that you refrain from asking any personal medical questions. So just to please consider the questions to ask that may prove beneficial to most versus something very specific to your individual case. So I hope that that makes sense to everyone before we proceed. And what I'll do is, as the questions are starting to come in, I'll move over to the first poll question here, and I'll ask the first question to Angelica. And so the first question is, I just watched a webinar this morning, Electrums 2017, and they mentioned that there are two types of MS, relapsing, remitting, and progressive. Is secondary progressive included when they say this? When trials are done and say they are targeting progressive MS, does this include secondary progressive? My impression was that they were two separate entities.
So thanks, Suzanne, for your question. Can you hear me, Jillian?
Yeah, just speak a little bit louder. We do ask that you don't mention names also. I know you didn't say last name, but nonetheless.
So yeah, thanks for your question about progressive MS. So yes, they are two separate entities, although there's a lot of debate as to whether they are in fact two separate entities or if MS is just one long continuum of the disease and people are being diagnosed at different stages of it. So that's another kind of lengthy debate. But ultimately, for the purposes of trials, primary progressive MS and secondary progressive MS are considered separate. So when they're recruiting, they do look for either one or the other or both. So for example, the ocrelizumab trial that was positive last year, or I think 2 years ago now they've submitted to the regulators, that was included mainly primary progressive MS patients. So that's what they were targeting. For the more recent trial in siponimod, it's another treatment that has shown positive results. That trial was targeting secondary progressive MS patients. So again, like that's the definition of these types of progressive MS. I'm getting feedback, but if no one else hears it, that's fine. So
no, you're good.
Okay. So for secondary, I find that what I hear is neurologists still have a lot of difficulty really defining the difference, and it's difficult because of the definitions, the clinical definitions and the diagnostic definitions. So that's what adds to the complication of progressive trials, but based on the McDonald criteria and based on the current definition of progressive MS, for the purposes of trials, they do identify if they're looking for primary or secondary or both. So yes, they do exist separately and are looked for separately in trials.
Thank you. And Angela, we also have Angela Clover on the line as well with the MS Society. And Angela, anything to add to that?
Nope, definitely not. Angelica has it.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, so moving on, simply, are there any clinical trials that you know of available in Alberta?
So the one that I'm aware of is the domperidone trial that's being conducted by Dr. Marcus Koch, Koch. He recently presented at our NMS conference. He's trying to do a number of trials, actually. He's testing different types of trial designs with repurposed medication. So I'm assuming domperidone is something that's been used before and for something else. And what he's doing is to accelerate treatment development for progressive MS, to accelerate that process and identify potential treatment sooner. He's undergoing the process of repurposing. So he's identifying a list of medications that are already available or have been used for other diseases, other conditions, and he's testing them based on their mechanism. Let's say they have some effect on the central nervous system or on neurodegeneration. He's seeing if they could be treated in people living with progressive MS. So best bet is to research Dr. Marcus Koch and see, if he's recruiting and if these trials are still ongoing. And as well, I can follow up to see where the status of those trials is at, because that's the one to my knowledge. There was a minocycline trial that Dr. Luann Metz was also doing. That's since been completed for a long time now, and the results are expected to be published this year. But that was looking at minocycline, again, another commercially available drug that's used for acne and other anti-inflammatory diseases and infections. And she tested the effects of this treatment in people with first signs of MS, clinically isolated syndrome, to see if it would prevent them from converting or slow the conversion to MS. And in fact, based on her conference presentations, that looked promising. So that was the one really big trial that we funded. But Dr. Marcus Koch is doing a number of other trials looking at repurposed drugs.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on. I was wondering why the number of participants of the Winnipeg-based trial is so low. Can you comment on that?
That's a really, really good question, and I was waiting for that question. The Winnipeg trial had undergone some significant challenges in the beginning, and that's very much expected from these types of trials. So these stem cells are collected and produced and expanded. When I say expanded, I mean they create large numbers of them so that they can inject them back into the patient. So to do that, they need to do that in what's called a government it's a GMP facility, and the acronym is escaping me, but essentially what that means is these facilities have been certified to be, they have been certified to produce the stem cells. So that in itself takes a long time, and they have to do a lot of trial runs to ensure that the facility was up to the standards. So that of course takes some time, and really Ottawa was the initial site for this, and so they had a lot of things up and running, and a lot of the personnel were trained, and Winnipeg joined in a little bit later, and they need Winnipeg essentially to reach their 40 patient quota, but they had to do some additional work to train them up to the level that Ottawa was at, and they also had changes in staffing. So it's just, some of the complications that we would expect from trials in terms of getting the right personnel on board and all the logistics, all the ethics, all the things that need to be checked off before the trial can begin. And so because Winnipeg joined afterwards, per se, joined a little bit later, they had to kind of get caught up, and they had to also, as I mentioned, they're only recruiting people from Manitoba. And again, this is mandated because Research Manitoba is a major funder of the study. So they do want to see people from Manitoba be the first to be selected. And I think now with the new, they have some new clinical trial staff on board. I think that's going to help speed everything up. There's a lot of interested candidates. So I think it's just processing them, getting them into the trial, and we'll see that number increase very soon.
Thank you. You're doing a great job answering these questions, Angelica, so thank you for that. Okay, so moving forward, what are the criteria to participate in the bone marrow and stem cell clinical trials?
Yeah, so the criteria for the bone marrow trial that we funded, I'm very familiar with that, and you can also find it online, was people with very, very active inflammatory relapsing remitting MS that they call treatment refractory. So they were not responsive to other treatments, and at the time there weren't as many. So now it could be a different story because there are other DMTs available. But at the time, you were not responsive to therapy. Your disease was advancing rapidly, and the reason for that is because of the risk associated with this procedure. You have to weigh benefit versus risk. So these are individuals who really couldn't turn to any other approach. And so the risk of essentially dying from the chemotherapy was something heavily considered. But in light of that, given the nature of their MS, they were willing to take that risk. So I think the criteria is heavily based on the risk associated with the procedure. They have to have tried other things and failed on those other treatments, and their disease has to show aggressive worsening. As of now, it is not being tried in people with progressive MS. And the reason for that, and that's a big question I get, is because in progressive MS, there's less inflammatory activity. So really they're targeting the inflammation here. They're shutting it down with the chemo, and they're reconstituting the immune cells. And so it's the immune aspect of the disease they're trying to shut down. And people living with progressive MS, there's less inflammation, if no inflammation at all. But the mesenchymal stem cell therapy that Mark Friedman is now looking at is recruiting people with progressive MS. So I believe the age range is 18 to 50, people with relapsing or progressive MS, primary or secondary, but those living with MS do have to show evidence of some inflammatory activity because, again, that's really the target. So a lot of treatments right now still are focusing on the inflammatory aspect. There's less knowledge about the neurodegenerative aspect, the tissue degeneration. So there's a race now to try to understand that part of the disease so they can target that. And there's a lot of really great work that's being done to understand, is it an energy malfunction? Is it calcium ion buildup? Is it, what's causing this damage? And that's what they're targeting. But right now, a lot of the therapies and trials are targeting inflammation. So even with people with progressive MS, to be eligible for a lot of trials, there has to be some evidence of that inflammatory activity.
Thank you. Okay, so we have lots of great questions, so I'm just jumping right in here again. Hi, although Dr. Friedman and Dr. Burt in the States don't recommend HSCT for PPMS, I was fortunate enough to have it overseas. It vastly improves my quality of life. Why do they poo-poo it here for PPMS?
So again, this is the same answer. In progressive MS, the main thing that they believe is happening is the degenerative component, the cell. There's something that's causing the cells in the central nervous system to be damaged, and it might not necessarily be inflammation. So essentially in the bone marrow trial, in that HSCT, which is the same thing, hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, I just don't like saying it because it's so long, but it's essentially the same thing. And what that's doing is it's shutting down inflammation, and it's reconstituting new, fresh immune cells. So if in progressive MS there is no evidence of inflammation, then they cannot test that treatment because that's what that treatment is targeting. So, you want to make sure that you understand the mechanism, that these researchers should understand the mechanism they're targeting. So if it's inflammation, then people who live with MS who are eligible have to have evidence of inflammation. That's how you'll know if there's a difference before and after. And so there are people with progressive MS who could potentially be treated with and benefit from the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, but it would have to be because of the inflammatory component. So if you do an MRI and you don't see any inflammatory activity, lesions changing or enhancement on the MRI, then it's difficult to say that you would be eligible because the target of that stem cell transplant is inflammation. That's the key. That's why for the Ottawa group, they focused heavily on those with very active inflammatory disease, because if you're going to subject someone to an intense chemotherapy, it basically better be worth, there's a lot of long-term safety risks associated with that. Jen Molson was very vocal about hormone therapy, having to get all of her shots every year. Really the repercussions of immune deprivation can be very grave. And so in order to subject someone to this, there has to be enough evidence to that researcher and that doctor that there's inflammatory activity that exists that can be treated.
Thank you. Okay. So do you have any research, or is there any research around biotin?
Yep. So I'm glad you asked because we are working on a message some content for our website that will be focused on biotin. So biotin or vitamin H or MD1003, however you've heard it as, has been tested in a clinical trial with progressive MS. The evidence, as reported in conferences, and I believe they have also published it, has shown some positive results in terms of reversal of progression, in terms of reversal of disability. And so these promising results have paved the way now for a larger trial that MedDay, the company in France who's doing this trial, is now conducting to understand the effects of biotin on a larger level. So the trial they've done so far is a smaller clinical trial. The only way you can really truly demonstrate efficacy with enough confidence that regulators will approve the treatment is if you do it in a very large phase 3 clinical trial. So we're looking at 700,000 up to 1,000 plus patients. And this is really important so that you can definitively say that this is due to the treatment and not due to chance or due to some other factors. And also to understand the safety, because again, if it's in a smaller group, it's difficult to say the safety in the broader population. And so biotin has shown some positive early results, and it will advance to a larger trial. But I do have to also point out, and this is part of our messaging online, is now we're getting questions that people can just go and buy biotin and it's the same thing. So I do want to point out that the biotin that's available commercially over the counter is not the same as what's being tested in the trial. In fact, the trial concentration or the trial dose is 300,000 times more than what you can get over the counter. So that gives you an idea of the difference between an over-the-counter biotin and the drug MD1003 that MedDay is looking at in clinical trials. They're different, and so they should be considered different. One should be considered a drug at the dose that it's being given at. It should have its own consideration of side effects, its own consideration of biological effects, and that might be different from what you would get from the over-the-counter biotin. So that's something to, I think, keep in mind. I'm not a doctor, so again, it's really up to the discussion you have with your healthcare professional if you feel that you want to take multiple doses of biotin or if you want to, explore that aspect. But ultimately, the dose that is being tested in the progressive MS trial is several-fold higher than what you can get over the counter. And so these trials then need to be done in order to really understand the safety. If it's that much more concentrated and that much more higher in dose, and these trials will help us understand if that's safe, if that's producing an effect, if other parts of the body are unaffected, because that could happen, if it's doing what it needs to do, and if it's something that can be tolerable in the body. And so these are important questions that trials can help answer. And so until then, it's always important to have that discussion with your healthcare team if you're curious about taking biotin.
Thank you. My goodness. Do you need a glass of water or anything like that?
Taking sips as I go, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So we'll keep going. Is there funding available for the cost of traveling to and participating in the trial?
That's a really good question, and that depends on the trial. So your best bet is to always contact the study coordinator. So each clinical trial has a clinical trial coordinator, and they do everything from answer questions, determine a person's eligibility. Some places might only accept referrals. Some places might, you can contact them directly. They'll also be the people who will do the consenting, so they'll explain all the risks. They'll have you sign consent forms. They'll go over the procedure with you. And so part of the cost of the trial could be paying for travel. Some trials might not pay for travel. So I can't speak on behalf of all trials, but I do know that it's possible depending on the budget of the trial, the location. If it's somewhere, ridiculously far and they understand that many people can't get there, they might incentivize people with some financial support. But that's something I think that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a question you should ask when you're about to enter a trial. And it doesn't seem like the obvious question. You might think, well, what are the risks are there needles, et cetera. But the question also should be, will I be compensated? Will my travel be covered? And this is the same with getting treatments overseas. Is I think a lot of people forget that they might have to pay for their lodging and travel and follow up, and there might be additional clinic visits where you have to stay for a month, and I don't think people realize that they have to pay for all those things, and they might not be communicated to them. So likewise with trials, we encourage you to ask those types of questions because it varies. Still there?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
I took myself on mute.
Okay.
There we go. I'm talking away, and I know it can hear me. Okay, here we go. Are there any collaborations or grants to the TISCH, Multiple Sclerosis of New York, am I saying that right, who have reported amazing results in stem cell treatments? The FDA has approved phase 2, and this appears to have repaired and the reversal of disability. And Canada, they're saying Canada and U.S. should work more closely together, and she would like your comments on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Canada, given the expertise we have here and the results that have come of that trial that we funded, I think there is a lot of potential to collaborate. Not to my knowledge, we're not collaborating on this particular trial, and there are challenges with collaborating on clinical trials. Well, there are. It's on one hand, you're able to gather lots of patients because you're recruiting from different countries, but you also have to face differences in the regulators. So FDA is not the same as Health Canada, is not the same as the European Medicines Agency in Europe. They all have different processes for approving treatments. I know the FDA, I think, maybe takes more of an active stance on approving stem cell as a treatment, whereas in Canada, maybe it's used more off-label and it's not necessarily subject to review unless it becomes more widespread in MS. So those are some changing landscapes, but to give an example of a collaboration, the mesenchymal stem cell trial is part of a larger international trial. I think it's 9 countries and 200 patients, and there's involvement from European countries, the U.S., Canada, and Canada is contributing a significant proportion of patients and data to that trial, and it's called Mezcam. That's the international trial, and Mezcam is a Canadian component of that. But that's an example of where we're collaborating with others and bringing together our resources, or they're bringing together their resources rather, to do these trials. But I'll look into this. I appreciate you bringing that up, and we'll look into it to see if there might be some. Sometimes there are Canadian researchers involved at arm's length as collaborators, so I'm not quite sure. But to my knowledge, I don't know if Canadians are collaborating on that project.
These are just having some excellent questions, so thank you very much to everyone who's asking away here. Okay, so we're going to keep going. If Angelica can hold tight for a few more minutes.
Yeah.
Are there any more research, or is there any more research about statin medication?
Yeah, so statins are, to backtrack a little bit, and my computer's far away from me, but I'm tempted to look this up, but statins are, we all know, cholesterol-lowering drugs, so they're already, again, another repurposing agent that might have some importance in progressive MS, or in progressive MS, rather. So a group from the UK, Dr. Jeremy Chataway, has done a clinical trial on simvastatin for progressive MS. It was positive. It's a smaller trial, not pharma funded or anything, so it's a smaller scale trial, but it was a positive trial. I don't know the details, but if you go on our website, mssociety.ca, we have an emerging treatment section in our research page that provides all the details of the statins in the trial. So if you're curious, you can go there. I don't have my computer with me, but off the top of my head, okay, I believe that they are looking to pursue more research in this, but it comes down to resourcing, so it's funding. Really is in getting enough people. These are clinical trials, are millions, billions of dollars, lots of resources, and so if you don't have the funding or the backing, it does become difficult. So I'm assuming they're looking to explore this a bit more, but it's really up to the resourcing and the timing and whether they can, I don't know if they're designing the trial right now, but I can look into that. But we do have an update on the latest trial on our website, which was reported, I think, several years ago now. On statins. So yeah, there's been some work in this and it's positive, but I don't know how much follow-up has been done.
Great, fair enough. Okay, so this is actually a question that I can answer, and one of our participants is curious as to how many people are logged in tonight. So currently, just so everyone knows, we've had a few drop-offs since we started the Q&A, but I think at the highest point we had around 60 people logged in. I have not checked to see yet where that falls in terms of across the country. I do know that in terms of registration, we had the majority of people residing in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And chances are probably pretty good that there's more than 60 people on the line if others are joining people, and that's why we ask you how many people are joining you tonight so we can capture those numbers. So yeah, in case you wanted to know, I figure if one's curious, more might be curious as well. So we have about 60 people or so at the very minimum on the line with us tonight participating in this evening's event. Okay, just have a great little comment here. I just wanted to say thank you to the person who is answering all of the questions, and that is Angelica, of course, and she has been amazing at answering all of these questions. So there you go, Angelica. Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, so we're just going to move on to another question, and then I apologize in advance if I mispronounced this, but why does the Mezcam have an age limit of 50?
So this is a question I get a lot. Probably the most common question I get in trials about clinical trials, and it's a question I've learned a lot about myself. Not being in this field and immersed in this before these last few years. So I'm glad. I appreciate the question, and I'm sure Angela, you get this a lot too about age limits and stuff. So my understanding, and again, it's more of a limited understanding, things I'm learning more about as I understand trials a bit better, is a clinical trial is designed and intended to measure a change in a short period of time. That is what the purpose of that is. And so they use specific measures and metrics to see if the treatment is producing an effect and if that effect is measurable. So in MS, as people living with MS age, changes in them physiologically are much less measurable. So inflammation slows down. Certain disease changes aren't as measurable. And also, as people living with MS age, there are other things that come into play. The aging effect, other conditions that one might be affected by, cancer, diabetes, and other conditions, and other effects of aging, just as a natural process. So as a result, a lot of trials do focus on the group where they can measure the fastest change or the change in the fastest period of time. And in MS, that's at that age group where they can measure inflammatory changes. The disease is likely more active in that stage. It doesn't plateau as much as it would at the older ages. There's less confounding is the term for it when other factors affect the results. So it's to achieve the cleanest data, but I can agree, and I'm sure you're all thinking, well, that's not representative because there are people over 50 who live with MS, and I 100% agree. And they also, so I think there's more attention now into trial designs that do involve people at older ages and new outcome measures, new metrics that can better assess changes in disease in people over those ages to really include them as part of the sample population. What's interesting, though, is now there's more registries, so real-world data, registries, cohort studies, real-world studies that look at how people actually do in the real world on treatment. So in a trial, everything's controlled, like clinical visits are 100%, imaging, the person's probably at 100% adherence because they know they're in a trial. So when you go out of the trial and people who are older who can be in trials, they are captured in these registries and real-world studies because they can input. There's things like NARCOMs or Patients Like Me. There are many registries and studies out there that capture real-world evidence on treatments in people who are maybe over 50. So it's important to look at that data as well to see how are they doing on these treatments. But unfortunately for trials, it becomes very limited to that group that they can measure an effect in. There's also the same can be said for progressive trials with people in wheelchairs. So people in wheelchairs feel left out because they're not eligible for trials, and that's because the measurement they're using is based on walking. So that's not going to be effective if people are in wheelchairs. So they're trying to, again, adapt the design to include maybe upper limb function, cognitive metrics, so that people in wheelchairs may also be able to participate in trials. So it's not necessarily it's not maybe not capturing everyone in the MS population, but to see an effect in a short period of time and get FDA and Health Canada to approve the drug, they need to show those effects in 1 to 2 years, and they can't do that in people over 50.
Thank you. So we have a bit of a departure from some of the trends of what the questions have been so far. So this kind of might be a nice switch for you. Can you speak a little bit about the role of nutrition and its importance with everyday meals? Are there any specific foods that we should be avoiding?
So nutrition is a really, really expanding field. On a research update level, there are a few trials looking at nutrition, but I will put in the caveat that nutrition studies, as you could probably imagine, are difficult to design. You can't put people in a closed room and feed them a diet every day. You know, people live real lives and have other factors and metabolic levels and different lifestyles. We're all different. So to say that if I eat a banana a day and Angela eats a banana a day and we'll look at what happens, I mean, that it's so hard to deduce that the banana is doing whatever we see at the end of 50 days. So nutrition studies overall are very, very difficult to design. However, the U.S. National MS Society is funding a $1 million clinical trial looking at the Terry Wahls diet. So, you know, I'm curious to know where that will go. I know a lot of people have brought up Terry Wahls diet to us here. So that's one area of research that's happening. Some people are looking at vitamin D. So going back to that topic, it kind of falls under nutrition because you can get it both from supplements and food. So, you know, vitamin D, there's a little bit more control that you can put in there because they're giving them as a supplement add-on to their treatment or alone. So there is some research happening, but a lot of the stuff out there is more observational. So it's, you know, there are people who are very open about their stories. Some people are on a purely vegetarian diet, high fiber. Some people follow paleo. And really, this is on a person-by-person basis. If that works for this person living with MS, then I think that's great and that actually warrants, you know, some merit to that because that's helping them feel better. But whether there's some modification to the disease underlying that, that's the question we don't know. They might just be feeling better overall. We all feel better when we eat healthier. So I think that could be just contributing to better mood, better sleep, more physical activity. So it's difficult to say if it's dealing with the MS or overall. There has been a couple studies in terms of foods to avoid that have demonstrated, and this is not in people, this is in animals and cells, that high salt can aggravate autoimmunity. So that would be the only type of research I can refer to on the top of my head where there's foods that might have some negative impact on MS. There's been a lot of research published out of some groups in the U.S. Again, that's on our website in the diet section. You can look at that there. And looking at salt, and they fed animals a westernized, they say, quote unquote, diet of high salt, similar to fast food levels, and their MS, the mice who had an MS-like disease showed worsening. So, you know, again, we don't quite know, and I don't think it's easy to just say, well, salt is doing it. I think it's contributing, but to what extent we don't know.
You had mentioned it was the Terry Wahls diet?
Yes.
Yes, that they're
the U.S.
investigating in the U.S.
is funding that.
And maybe if I could just add something here to the group is I encourage you when you have questions about be it diet or nutrition or things that we would consider, say, non-traditional medicinal type research or information, please do speak with your local chapter of the MS Society or your local division and encourage them to bring in speakers on these particular topics of wellness issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. And I've just, Angelica, you mentioned that on the MS Society there is a link there for diet, so I just posted it on the.
Oh, perfect.
Just so.
Beat me to it. Thank you. Yeah. So for those on the phone, Terry Wahls, thanks. And so that link leads you to our diet page, and there's a whole section on hot topics actually, so you can look at a whole range of things, and we're going to add more things like medical cannabis and risk factors. But yeah, that's a great place to start, and it gives you a breakdown of what's happening around there and the different diets that have been proposed to be beneficial for MS. But again, I would place that caveat that these diet studies can be very difficult to draw definitive conclusions from.
Okay, so I know that we have more questions coming in, but I think we really only have time for one more. And I'll just go by sheer order. Are there many studies being done with respect to myelin regeneration?
So myelin regeneration, that's a great question, is the holy grail. as we say, of research right now. This is the goal. I think that a lot of research into the inflammatory aspect of MS has been really, really progressive. There's been a lot of great findings about which cells play a role, and that's not even fully elucidated yet, but there's been a lot of work to understand that component, hence the success in these anti-inflammatory treatments. But it's the repair piece that really is what's leaving the researchers wondering, how do we encourage repair? And even for those who have really severe disability, how do you bring back function? How do you repair damaged tissue in the central nervous system? And that's an even harder question to answer. But myelin repair is really the holy grail that researchers are trying to achieve. And there's been so much work. In fact, the society has funded a number of operating grants, a number of research grants that are focused on these very molecular targets in the repair process. They now are trying to understand protein XYZ is actually involved in repair. How do we harness that, stimulate that? It's all of that basic science work needs to happen for us to understand the process of repair and how we can exploit it therapeutically, how we can enhance it to do that in people living with MS. There was, you probably recall, the anti-LINGO trial. So LINGO is a protein that was thought to be blocking repair. So Biogen, I believe, was developing an anti-LINGO treatment, and it was not positive. It was some positive in some optic neuritis patients. So there was some signal in terms of the visual pathway, but there was clinically they did not see improvement. So that's disappointing. But again, even negative trials tell us a picture of what might be happening and give us a lot of insight. But myelin repair is the research strategy right now. A lot of grants that have come into our organization have been focused on repair. There's more and more information now about the repair process, about oligodendrocytes, about how they wrap the myelin. All of this is going to be important for us to develop the right treatment. So we always encourage more research on repair so that those treatments can come into play.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave off. It's 7:31 Eastern, so we're just slightly over time, so I think we probably need to end it now. I do want to thank everyone for their participation this evening. It always makes for a wonderful event when we have such great investment from our participants and wonderful interaction. Of course, I want to thank our presenter today, Angelica, not only for her presentation and the content, but for her wonderful responses to all of your terrific questions as well, because that's being put on the spot. So, Angelica, thank you so much. 3 reminders before you all depart. A recording of this webinar will be available on the MS Society of Canada website, hopefully within a week or so, and it is posted in the chat pod, that link, and you'll also be able to find it on Brain Exchange as well. Tonight's event is the 3rd of an 8-part learning series brought to you by MS Society of Canada. So please keep posted or keep in touch and keep looking for those future events as we're moving through. And finally, you will very shortly be receiving an email requesting your participation in a survey from the MS Society. And we do invite you to quickly take part in that survey. It won't take you long, and so just keep an eye on it in your email inboxes. So at this point, I just want to invite Angela Covert of MS Canada to say any final words, or Angelica, you as well.
I want to thank you, Jillian, for all the work that you did in behind the scenes. I appreciate that, and especially those on the line, and of course for the questions and the comments. I always learn something very new from Angelica each time I hear her speak, and I've heard her a few times. I appreciate the research, Angelica, that's happening in wellness, and I think that's going to be very exciting information because that is another key area. Angelica, do you have any last words?
I just wanted to thank everyone. Honestly, those were really excellent questions. They're questions we get all the time, so I really appreciate you reminding me that these are really things that we want to educate people about in terms of trials. So I appreciate all the questions, and we encourage you also to participate or to ask questions of the Knowledge Network. So we've recently launched like a hotline where you can call if you have any immediate questions, or a lot of questions coming in there are based on research. So if you have a burning research question, you're always welcome to go to the Knowledge Network. The information, I don't have it on me, but it's on our...
The email I can tell you is msnavigators@mssociety.ca.
Yeah, so you can email them. There's also the number on our website, and I think that's a great place to start if you have any other questions. And anything research related does go through our team anyway, so you can always ask your questions there if something comes up after tonight. But otherwise, thank you as well, Jillian, for all of your help and support.
My pleasure. Okay, so thank you all very, very much for your time, and have a good evening. All the best, everyone. Good night.